Hello, everybody. My name is Pascal Vincent, and I'll be chairing the first session. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome as our invited speaker opening the ICLR 2018 conference, Erik Brynjolfsson, who's a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, director of the MIT Initiative on Digital Economy, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Erik has been passionate for many years on researching the effect of information technology on our economic life. And in addition to many scientific publications, he's also the author of a New York Times bestseller, The Second Machine Age, and a 2017 book, Machine Platform, Crowd Harnessing Our Digital Future. He's certainly a person to turn to if you want to get answers to the all-important and very delicate question that you may be asked by friends or strangers alike. Is AI going to take away our jobs? So please welcome Erik Brynjolfsson.
All right, thank you very much, Pascal, and thank you to Joshua and Jan for inviting me here. It's a real honor and a privilege to be at this conference. I'm very impressed by the exponential growth, and I hope this is part of a continuing long-term trend. The first AI conference I went to was back over 30 years ago at AAAI in 1986, and I've continued to be very involved. And I'm very impressed with the progress that has really accelerated recently. I think we may be on the verge of an era where you can take an ordinary laptop like this and plug it in and just instantly have a display on the big screen without any dongles. And so I think we call that the singularity, and I hope you guys achieve that soon. But seriously, I do think it's quite remarkable what's been happening in the field, and economists like me have been taking note and paying more and more attention. And I used to be a bit of a lonely voice looking at this question, but now there are half a dozen Nobel Prize winners that are doing projects on it. There are economic conferences. Our main economic conference, the Annual Economic Association, had about a dozen sessions devoted to some aspect of artificial intelligence and machine learning and the effects on the workforce. So you guys are having a really big impact on the rest of the world, the rest of society, and it's something we're taking note. And as Pascal was mentioning, I'm sure you're getting some questions now about what you're doing and maybe even a bit of a backlash. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the economics behind that, some research we've been doing to understand better what the effects have been of some earlier and related technologies, and then what is likely to happen going forward, or what potentially could happen going forward, depending on what we all do. So let me start by giving you sort of a really big picture perspective and take a look back a couple hundred years, 250 years ago or so, because this is not the first time we've had these big, momentous technological changes. And although history doesn't repeat itself, I think sometimes we can learn a bit from what's happened in the past. And if you look at the economic history of humanity, what you find is that most of it was extremely boring for centuries, actually millennia. Living standards didn't change. There were kings and queens and empires and philosophers and religions and natural catastrophes and diseases, but the average person's life really was pretty much the same day in and day out. But then something changed. If you look at the late 1700s, things really started to change for the average person. And you can measure this by GDP per person or population or social development index. They all are very correlated, and things took off. And I think a lot of my colleagues think, that this was because of technology, invention of some amazing new technologies, most notably James Watts's massively improved steam engine, which, as you know, ignited the Industrial Revolution and set off much, much steeper economic growth, a couple of % per year, compounded annually, and it starts adding up very quickly over time, doubling and growing exponentially, not quite as fast as the exponents on the conference here, but still some pretty good exponents. And the real driver of that was the steam engine, which economists now recognize as one of the first really powerful general-purpose technologies. General-purpose technologies are special because they not only help a particular application, but they have these three characteristics. They're pervasive, they're able to be improved over time, and most importantly, they spawn complementary innovations. So the steam engine originally was used to pump water out of coal mines, but as you know, it could be used for many other things, locomotives and many kinds of transportation steamships, powering factories. And as people figured out how to harness this muscle power, this substitute for muscle power, they were able to add tremendously to our living standards. Now, there are other general-purpose technologies that have a big impact. The internal combustion engine, electricity that is powering our lights and our computers and continues to spawn new innovations. And I think you can probably guess where I'm going with this. AI is a GPT. It's pervasive. The applications can be done in so many different areas. We're only scratching the surface, but these core breakthroughs that you all are developing in classification, labeling, perception, etc., have applications in just about every part of the economy. Certainly, the essence of it is that it improves over time. Tom Mitchell and I wrote an article in Science last December where we discussed this a little bit more, and I'll dive into that a little bit later in my talk. But the essence of it really is improving over time. And the fact that it can spawn these complementary innovations, that these core capabilities like vision give rise to all sorts of other capabilities in medical imaging, in driving cars, and you could go on with the other things, the other innovations that build on machine learning and artificial intelligence. In fact, although there's been a lot of hype and exaggeration, and I don't want to go too far out, as you know, we're very, very far from anything like artificial general intelligence or the stuff you see in Hollywood. It's also true that this is I think, at least on the scale and scope of those other GPTs like the steam engine and electricity. In fact, I think you could make a case that AI is the most general of all GPTs. I mean, intelligence is a really fundamental capability. Demis Hassabis puts it in their mission statement at DeepMind. Our goal is to solve intelligence and then use that to solve all the other problems in the world. So that's a very general type of technology if that's achieved, or even if some piece of it gets achieved. So, there's some good news, and I could talk about the remarkable things that are happening, but I also want to remind everybody, as you know from watching Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. And I'm not with those technologists, some of whom I debated recently, who say, hey, our job is just to make the technology and not think or worry about what happens. That's for somebody else to think about. And there is a school of thought that says, science should be pure and unfettered and not consider the consequences. I strongly disagree with that, and one of the reasons I'm giving this talk to you all today is to get you to think a little bit about some of the consequences, because I do think that you can steer the direction of technology, and technology is not neutral. Technology is not completely unbiased, that depending on the innovations, you could make a smallpox vaccine, or you could make a killer virus that could be weaponized, and you could make nuclear power for weapons, or you could make it for peaceful purposes. And so it is with just about every technology. And as you develop them, I think as it becomes more and more powerful, you need to be more and more thoughtful about what those applications are. And don't just do it, for your own sake, although I think that would be a good reason and for society's sake, But also, you have to realize that if you don't, other people are going to step in. And if you pay attention to the news or talk to your colleagues outside of machine learning, you've probably noticed that there's a brewing backlash against technology, that you're hearing more and more people worried about it. This happened back with the steam engine, and these are the Luddites. Ned Ludd, almost exactly 200 years ago, a fictional character, helped inspire a revolution where people literally smashed the machines, the spinning machines that were automating the work of weavers, and they saw that as a threat to their livelihoods. And actually, to some extent they were right. A lot of them did lose their jobs. Their wages did go down. Other people benefited even more than they were hurt. But from their narrow, selfish perspective, this was not a good technology for them. And today, you see Mark Zuckerberg being hauled in front of Congress, and their articles, I guess the cute word to call it is a tech clash against many of the big companies. And literally just yesterday, Sergey Brin was writing about the threat that AI poses, as well as the benefits. In particular, he said that their company is giving serious thought to problems like job destruction from artificial intelligence. And in other work, I've described 6 specific challenges for technology. The first one is this economic one about automation inequality. Will a robot eat people's jobs? But there are others, and I'm sure if you think about it, you've heard discussion of these. There's the whole issue of false news and cyber balkanizations and algorithms affect, maybe amplifying and spreading sensational news, which increases engagement, but also sensational news, if you think about it, it's not surprising, tends to disproportionately be false. So if your algorithm is tuned to maximize engagement, you may inadvertently also be maximizing lies. And that's something you need to think about. There's issues around algorithmic bias. When we use these machines to hire people, to decide who gets parole, who gets credit, and who doesn't get financial credit, if those are trained on biased data sets, if the people who made the hiring decisions before had some kind of explicit or perhaps more invidiously subtle biases, those could be perpetuated in the algorithms and amplified and extended. And so that's something you need to be paying attention to. There are issues around the end of privacy. Winner-take-all markets is a bigger and bigger issue. Whether or not our capitalist free market system that depends on lots of competition is robust to technology production functions that tend to have a winner-take-all characteristic, where someone gets a lead, they get put further and further ahead. That's an unstable equilibrium that isn't conducive to competition. And then there are a whole set of cyber risks, and the one that I'm very worried about is for instance, our voting systems. But anytime you hear about the millions of bots that are fighting each other right now on the internet, attacking and defending our key systems and other people's key systems, you can't help but be worried about it. I'm not going to talk about all of those in any detail. Given the time available, I'm going to zoom in on the first one, which I actually think is perhaps the greatest challenge of our era, the greatest thing that we need to be concerned about. And people have put it different ways. I mean, one way of framing it is, will humans go the way of horses? Horses were once very productive, important parts of our economy. They all had jobs, and there were millions of them doing all sorts of work in the economy. When the steam engine came along, actually, it didn't do much of a dent in horses at all. The number of horses employed increased. But then later technologies, particularly the internal combustion engine, kicked in, and then you started seeing that there was a lot less demand for horses. So peak horse was right around 1922. After that, it was all kind of downhill. Actually, I did some further research, and lately there's been a little resurgence. Horses, not used so much for transportation, but for recreation, and it's probably more fun for them to the extent that they have those jobs. But this is something that a number of people have asked: is there something similar to what could happen to human labor that happened to horse labor? And as you can see, we wrote a whole article describing that in some detail, and I won't go through all of the parts of it. But the short answer is no, it's too soon to worry about the end of work or the end of labor. What I know about artificial intelligence and what I know about human capabilities, I come to the very strong conclusion that there's no shortage of work that only humans can do, at least right now and probably for several decades. It may be, and I think it's even likely, that someday, some decades in the future, we will be able to make machines that do the full spectrum of what humans do. But that's not the challenge we face today. In fact, there's so much work that needs to be done in areas like healthcare, the arts, cleaning up the environment, science and medicine, and just anything that involves sort of a human touch, that I feel it's very premature to be planning an economy for a world with the end of work and, people are just all on, say, universal basic income and machines do everything. Again, maybe someday, but the challenge we face right now is a little different, and that is a challenge of income distribution. Because while there's a lot of work that needs to be done that only humans can do, machines cannot do them currently, the way that the income is distributed is becoming increasingly uneven, and a lot of that has to do with technology. The first order effect of the technology is that it's making the economic pie bigger. It's creating a huge amount of wealth. But if you read the economics textbooks carefully, you also should be aware that there's no economic law that says that everyone, or even that most people, are going to benefit proportionately. It's possible for some people to get nothing. It's possible for some people actually to be made worse off, like those weavers who are affected by the Luddites. And if you look at the equations carefully, it's possible for a majority of people to be made worse off, even as the pie is getting bigger. Now, how can that happen? Obviously, it can happen if that group that's getting more is getting so much more that there ends up being less in the remaining 50, 60, 70% of the population. Now, that is absolutely not what's happened for most of the past couple of hundred years. It's been mostly a rising tide that, with certain exceptions here and there, if you happen to be making, horse buggies or something, you had to retrain. But by and large, it's been benefiting broad sections of the economy until about the past 20 years. And something very disturbing has happened. That's I started writing my books about on this topic. Andrew McAfee and I call it the Great Decoupling. Productivity, or output per hour, has continued to grow in the United States, and that's the blue line there. So that's good news. The pie is getting bigger. Each one of us, on average, is able to produce more output, more wealth than we did before. And historically, the red line kind of tracked it pretty close. That was the income of not the average, but the median. And you guys all know that the median's at the 50th percentile. So it's nothing. There's no law that says that has to track the average. And in fact, it's become more uneven. And if you look at the 50th percentile and you adjust it for inflation, so you make it real income, it's been kind of flat since about the late 1990s, the year 2000 or so. And that's kind of disturbing. Again, how can that happen? It can happen if the growing pie is disproportionately going to one group. And I'm going to, in a little while, show you some of the economics, but just to motivate this, I want to remind you that this is not just an economic problem. The effects go well beyond economics. So, for instance, here's something that Anne Case, a great economist, and her husband, Angus Deaton, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, have described. They call it deaths from despair. And they got a lot of attention for pointing out or recognizing that these deaths from despair have really gone up quite dramatically in the United States. This is something that didn't happen before. Death rates used to be going down in America and all the world. And now there are certain groups, particularly white Americans, males with less than high school education, who are dying at a much higher rate. And you can see that the darker areas of the United States here are the areas with more deaths from despair. They're in Appalachia, big parts of the South and Southwest. Very disturbing trend, gotten a lot worse. And as I mentioned, It's the less educated workers that are particularly affected there. You go back to the year 2000, and the rates were much lower, and the bottom sort of lighter gray lines is people with college degrees, but the rapidly rising lines are people with high school degrees or less are dying from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, and that's how Case and Deaton defined deaths from despair. And so you can look more specifically at things like poisoning, chronic liver disease, diabetes. These are going up at frighteningly scary rates. So you heard about the opioid epidemic. They actually wrote their paper even before that became widely recognized, but it just amplifies the point they're making. And other measures of social decay, for instance, children living with their biological parents has really diverged depending on whether you're in the top or bottom income quartile. And this is not just Case and Deaton. This one is by Charles Murray. The people who are imprisoned in jails had skyrocketed. So there are lots of drivers of these trends, and they're obviously things that we should all be concerned about, and there are books and essays written about it. But for this audience, I think we're especially interested in what is the role, if any, of technology. Does it play a role in these effects, and how could it play such a role? Why would it even affect things like that? Well, some of my colleagues and I and others have been doing research on this for some time, and I think this quote from David Otter and David Dorn summarizes it pretty nicely. They did a terrific paper. David Otter is one of my colleagues at MIT, and David Dorn's was over at Harvard when he did this. And I'll just read it. The adoption of computers substitutes for workers performing routine tasks, such as bookkeeping, clerical work, and repetitive production and monitoring activities, which are readily computerized because they follow precise, well-defined procedures. And so they showed this empirically. And if you look at the data, it's very striking. You can see that there's been a great deal of falling demand for these categories of routine work. So the dark line that's steeply falling there are these clerical types of jobs, sales jobs, the routine work. And as you can see, they grew a bit in the 80s and flat through the 90s, and then they started really falling quite a bit in the 2000s. Meanwhile, professional work, service work has continued to grow, but it's not the same people in those different categories. So you have more demand for one kind of labor and less demand for other kinds of labor, and that shows up not only in employment but in wages, and ultimately in the labor market participation, and apparently in things like the social indicators that I showed you earlier. My first book that really looked at this with Andrew McAfee tried to understand it much more carefully, and we really identified three trends, which I'm going to dive into a little bit more closely. The first was this idea that some skill groups, people with, say, college education versus high school education, were disproportionately favored. A second related trend but distinct, is that superstars, people who are at the very top, the top 1%, the top 0.01%, the top 0.001% in different professions, were pulling away. And the returns at the very top of the income distribution were increasingly shaped like a Pareto or power law distribution as opposed to a log normal distribution. And as you may know, those kinds of distributions can have very fat tails, and the payoff, if you're in that end of the distribution, has been getting much, much higher than it used to be. You can now, if you have a good idea, you can reach a million or even a billion people in a way that you couldn't have 20 or 30 years ago. And then last but not least, there's also seems to be a shift in the share of GDP going to owners of capital as opposed to providers of labor. So if you own a factory, if you're an investor in the stock market or directly in businesses or own equipment, even if you own land, you've done very well. Whereas if you mainly sell your labor, your time, those wages have been relatively flat, and that's been a shift. I'll show you more data on all of this. So we wrote about this, and as I said, this has really become much more of a consensus among economists. Tom Mitchell and I chaired a commission for the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that we published about a year ago now. And one of our key conclusions was that the case that technological advances were contributing to wage inequality was quite strong. And the report goes into much more detail about that. But this was a very diverse, multidisciplinary group that had economists, computer scientists, sociologists, a lot of other people looking at a broad set of data. And frankly, we spent a lot of time debating and coming to some common understanding because we came from a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds. Larry Summers, who used to be president of Harvard, he was the Secretary of Treasury, National Economic Council under Obama and also under Clinton. He puts it, I think, very nicely. Almost every economist who studied this question believes that technology has a greater impact on the wage structure than international trade. So certainly globalization has been part of the issue, but the role of technology has been more important. My colleagues, Daron Acemoglu and Pascal Restrepo, Pascal's now at BU, went more specific and did some empirical work looking at where robots were purchased and set up throughout the United States. They had a way of seeing when it was exogenous, and their estimate was that you could see a reduction in the wages of the human workers there of just under 1%. So that was quite significant. Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize winner I mentioned a little bit earlier, weighs in similarly. So does Larry Katz. Larry Katz is maybe the best labor economist of our generation, editor of one of the main journals in the field. He's a professor at Harvard. And he puts it very clearly, too, that long automation is what's driving all these trends. It's not even close. So let me explain a little bit about how that happens and why that is happening. And the key concept is something called biased technical change. I don't mean biased like it's unfair or anything. I just mean that biased in the sense that it doesn't affect the whole economy exactly evenly. The simplest models of economic growth by people like Bob Solow, who also got a Nobel Prize, basically took the production function of the economy and put a multiplier in front of it and said, technology just makes everything grow faster. And he got, he did a lot of work on that, and that's a good starting point. But it's not entirely realistic. Actually, let me just say, it was not a bad model of the economy for much of the past couple of hundred years, but it's not as good a model for the past 20 or 30 years because now that technology multiplier doesn't affect all the different inputs evenly. Instead, it affects some more than others, and that's the sense that it's biased. So let me give you three particular biases that have been apparent empirically in recent technology. The first one is this difference between the effect on high-skilled workers versus low and mid-skilled workers. So if you go into, a fast food place or lots of other places, you'll see technologies being implemented, but every worker in that shop is not evenly affected. The manager is being affected differently than the clerical workers or the counter help. Here's one example of a technology, but there's many others. For whatever reason, recent technologies have disproportionately automated people with high school the work of people with high school educations or middle skill clerical work. And I can show you a picture, but let me show you the data. Here's work by Daron Acemoglu, who I mentioned earlier, and David Otter, who I also mentioned earlier. And I think this is quite striking. If any of you guys have kids or cousins who are thinking about going to college or graduate school, you could show them this chart. So if you look at the early part of the period there, in the 60s, there was a bit of a rising tide that lifted all boats. If you had lots of education, your income grew rapidly. But even if you were a high school dropout, your wages were going up. They're all normalized to start at the same point in 1963. So those were the good times. Then the oil shock hit. There were a bunch of setbacks in the 70s, and everybody kind of took a bit of a hit. But since then, you've seen this fanning out. The people at the top of the educational distribution have resumed income growth, and so I'm sure the people in this room are almost all or probably all on that blue line at the top, so good for you, good for me, and good for us, I guess. College graduates, okay, but not so great, especially the past decade has been kind of flat. But then you look at the bottom three lines, and they're pretty discouraging. And this is all demographically adjusted. So this is not a shift, from men to women or races or whatever. This is demographically adjusted. And they have similar charts for other demographic groups. This particular one looks at male workers, but look at the paper for all the other groups. They look kind of similar. Just so you can calibrate this, the average person in the economy is not like the average person in this room. The average person in the U.S. economy, and for that matter, Canada or Europe, is around where that green line is, some college. Most Americans have not graduated from college. More than half of them have less education than that. So that's the kind of effect. They're looking at those bottom three lines, and you can imagine that's not such good news for them compared to what happened in the early part of the 20th century. Well, that's the first kind of bias technical change. Economists call that skill bias technical change, and there's a big literature on it. The second one is this shift that I alluded to before between capital and labor. So, our friend Travis has put that nicely. When there's no other dude in the car, the cost of taking an Uber anywhere becomes cheaper than owning a vehicle. That's great news for the customer. That's great news for shareholders and capital owners. It's not such great news for people who used to make a living doing that particular kind of labor. They need to find something new to do to maintain their income, or maybe hopefully increase it by doing something else. We don't see a lot of self-driving cars out there. There's been huge investment, and as far as I know, no driver has been replaced by a self-driving car yet. But we are seeing it in, and I suspect we will see it. You guys know better than I. But we have already started seeing this capital substitution kicking in to a big extent in other areas. One of the, and you can see this in this chart here, if you look at the blue line, that is the share of GDP, the share of all of America's income that goes to laborers. And the light green line is the share of corporate profits. And one of the actually sort of surprising things you learn in introductory economics is something that's called a Caldor fact, which is for most of the past 200 years, those lines kind of bounced around, but they didn't really move that much. The share of GDP that went to labor was pretty stable for most of the past couple hundred years. But now they have to revise those textbooks because it's not true anymore. Starting again about, 20 years ago, the late 90s, the share going to labor has started to really plummet. And the share going to capital has started going up. So the Caldor fact, as it was called, is no longer true about stable shares of labor. So if you are someone who primarily makes your income by selling your labor, you're getting a smaller share of the pie compared to previously. Now, you may wonder, is this U.S. only? Many of my stats are from the United States. But in the book, in the articles, we go in more detail just to quickly show you, it's actually a worldwide phenomenon. You're seeing similar things, both on the skill bias technical change, also on the capital bias technical change in the U.S., Japan, China, Germany. In fact, of the big OECD countries, of the, I think it's 23 of them, 22 of the, all but one of them have had a decline in the capital share. The decline in the labor share and a growth in the capital share. And then the last kind of bias technical change is this shift towards superstars. If you happen to be at the very pinnacle of your profession, if you're a superstar machine learning expert, or if you're a superstar singer, if you're a superstar, this is Scott Cook, he's a billionaire who invented TurboTax, or developed it, that there are opportunities to make way more money than you ever could have before. So there are more millionaires, more billionaires than ever in history. And again, there are a number of reasons for this, but one of the big reasons is technology lets you scale. If you can codify your ideas into a digital form, you can reach a lot more people, and even if you only make a few dollars off of each one of them, that can be a lot of money. And here's the data on that. You've all heard about the 1%. The 1% have their own 1%. And that is the 0.01%. And if you look at that, you can see that the share of income going to the 0.01% is at a record high. The only time it was even close was right before the Great Depression, if that's any consolation. And by the way, it's very fractal. We have a paper where we look at all the different percentiles, and each subgroup above the others has gotten a bigger share. So it's sort of a Pareto or fractal thing. The 0.01% is getting more of the 1%. The 0.001% is getting a bigger share of the 0.01%, and so on. So that's the power law I was describing to you before. Now, this is all from really what I would call the first wave of the computer revolution, which was kind of backwards looking. This is what the data say, and as things turn out, we only have data from the past. We don't have a lot of data from the future. But this, you may wonder, is this what's going to be the future as well? Because this was really based on codifying knowledge. I mean, coding has historically meant taking something you know and putting it into a codified form. And once you codify it, you can digitize it. And once you digitize it, you can replicate it. And that's been the engine of a lot of what we've been seeing so far. It's created trillions of dollars worth of value and trillions of dollars worth of redistribution of value from some people to other people. It's because of these economics of high fixed costs and low marginal costs. A lot of work to make that first copy of TurboTax or that first record album song, and then you can replicate it very, very cheaply. But there are limits to that, and one of the limits is what we call Polanyi's paradox. He was a philosopher who presciently said, we know more than we can tell. So I know how to recognize my mother's face. This is my mother. And I can recognize it very easily. I would have a hard time writing some C code about how far apart her eyes are, or where her ears are, or whatever. And historically, this was an example of something that that humans couldn't express in words. I couldn't describe very well how to recognize my mother out of 1,000 people. And therefore, you couldn't codify it. But of course, you know that that's no longer true because we no longer write code the old way. We now have machines that learn, and we've made huge progress in things like computer vision. Here's some data from the AI Index, a group that I work with on the ImageNet Challenge, and you can see the blue line there of the tremendous progress. Well, you guys know this, and in speech recognition, and in robots, and in games and reasoning. I have zero doubt that there's going to be some announcements of more breakthroughs, over the next couple of days. And what's key to all of these is machine learning. And this is a different paradigm. This is a paradigm where instead of us coding and telling step by step what the machine does, we give it examples and the machine learns on its own. And this has overcome Polanyi's paradox. We now can recognize faces. We now can learn how to ride a bike or do many other things that we can't express in words. But as long as we can provide a training set, the machine can figure it out on their own. So what's going to be the effect of that going forward? Is it the same as what we saw before? Well, one report I worked on that, which I'm now not sure I agree with anymore, is that the economic effects of AI and cognitive jobs may be analogous, or will be analogous, it says, to the effects of automation on manufacturing jobs. So maybe we just extend all those charts that I just showed you. But that's a guess. That's not for sure. To really know, we need to think about what kinds of jobs will be affected by these new technologies versus the old ones. And to do that, we need to assess the suitability for machine learning of different kinds of tasks. And as I said, we're very far from artificial general intelligence, but there are certain tasks where machine learning is human or superhuman. I just showed you some charts of that. So what Tom Mitchell and I set about doing was figuring out what are those tasks and where are they in the economy. So we made a questionnaire, a rubric, with 23 questions to tell you whether a particular task was likely to be a good fit for machine learning or not. And I don't think we did a perfect job, but I think anyone in this room could probably have somewhat of a guess as to whether a task is likely to be suitable for machine learning or not. We went and vetted this with many of our many experts in the field, and we came up with a questionnaire that we thought was pretty confident of. And then we took that questionnaire and we applied it to a big data set called ONET. The U.S. government conveniently has divided the entire economy into 964 occupations, like bus driver, professor, radiologist. Sadly, there's not one called machine learning researcher, not yet, but maybe there will be in a future version. And for each of those 964 occupations, they describe a set of tasks that you must do. Most occupations have about 20 to 30 tasks. This is what a bus driver does. This is what a radiologist does. And so we combined our rubric with those tasks. We basically applied each of our 23 questions to each of the tasks and got an assessment of how many of those tasks in the economy might be suitable for machine learning. And we wrote this up in this article, in this journal, in Science. And you can get a free copy on my website if you don't want to go through the paywall. There are a bunch of questions. I won't go through all 23 questions. Here's one of them. You guys could guess that if you have data, then it makes it a lot easier than if you don't have data. And then we applied it to jobs. So this is radiologists. Many people think of radiologists as something that might be affected. According to ONET, there are 27 distinct things that a radiologist must do, and they kind of conflate radiologists with radiation medicine here. Number 4 is interpret images using computer-aided detection or diagnosis. That's what we kind of think of as something that vision systems will be able to do a lot for. But look at these other ones. Develop treatment plans and interact with your colleagues and talk to the patient. Those are not things that machine learning is very good at. And this was actually quite common, we found, that when you looked at all the tasks of a particular occupation, some of them were suitable for machine learning, but many others were not. So there was no case where machine learning just ran the table and was able to do the whole set. And for that matter, there was virtually no occupation where machine learning didn't make at least some dent in it. That's radiologists. Here's truck drivers. Similarly, you may get self-driving trucks, but what about wrapping up and securing the goods with pads, packing paper, etc.? Not something robots can do, as far as I know, right now. Now, you can model this, and I'm seeing I'm a little bit out of time, and with a little bit of work, you can come up with how different occupations are affected. So are there any massage therapists in the room? No? Okay, well, you guys would have been in very good shape. They're the least likely to be automated in our analysis. And you can get the whole list in that article. I'll show you a scatter plot so you get a little bit of a feel for the data. The striking thing about this scatter plot, actually, I think, is how even it is. The x-axis is wages. And what you see, if you rank every occupation in the U.S. economy from the one that has the lowest wages to the highest wages, and then the vertical axis is how suitable it is for machine learning, it's pretty flat. The ones that are suitable for machine learning, some of them are very low paid, like concierges, and some of them are higher paid, like parts of radiology, and many of them are in the middle. So unlike earlier waves, it doesn't seem to be just affecting the low end. It's affecting a whole spectrum. So my quick takeaway from that is we should not blindly extrapolate from the past. This is a different technology that's going to affect different groups of people. Some fun things you can do with it. You can look at which parts of the U.S. geography are most affected. You can do it by subgroups. We asked about image data. We asked about text data. We asked about speech data. And they have different effects. And so now we're beginning to get a map of where, when you guys make a breakthrough in voice recognition systems, which types of jobs, which parts of the country will be most affected. Let me skip through this a little bit. Well, I'll just very quickly show you. More interesting than geography is actually grouping them in a space of tasks, that there are some types of jobs that just cluster together. You know, for instance, clerical workers in whatever industry, whatever geography, are very similar to each other. They have a lot of common tasks. So are medical professionals. And as it turns out, that the clerical workers, wherever they are, whatever industry, tend to have high suitability for machine learning, and the medical professionals not so much. So let me wrap up before I go to questions. I want to save a few minutes for Q&A from the audience with some comments about what we should do. So one thing we can do is change our policies. And policymakers have a whole bunch of policies. One of my favorites is something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. In the interest of time, I won't describe it in detail, but it's in my books and articles. But there are lots of others: universal basic income, minimum wage, etc. And we need to think about all these parameters we have. It is absolutely not true that the effects of technology are externally driven. It really depends on how they interact with the policies. And we happen to have a particular economic set of policies that gives to rise to one equilibrium, but that's ultimately a choice. But it's not just policymakers. It's also the private sector that can do a lot of things. Depending on what kinds of business models you implement, you can have more widely shared prosperity, or you can have more concentrated wealth. And inspired by the DARPA Grand Challenge that inspired some new technologies, at MIT we've launched something called the Inclusive Innovation Challenge, where we are encouraging entrepreneurs to come up with ways of using these technologies that create more broadly shared prosperity. We're giving out $1 million to the winners of that, and we now have contests running in Detroit, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and they're all the winners in each of those competitions will then come to Cambridge, Massachusetts for the grand finale. So we've inspired hundreds of entrepreneurs to be working on using technology, regardless of what the policymakers do, to direct change towards more shared prosperity. And let me just wrap up before we go to questions with some ideas about what you can do in this room, because I don't think you should just sit back and leave it to the entrepreneurs and the policymakers. I think technologists can play a big role. One thing you can do is think about how your technologies are being used either to replace humans or to augment humans. Those are not the same thing. You can enhance human capabilities and make them more valuable as workers, and many technologies do that, or you can replace humans and make them less valuable. It's very tempting, I think, to think of a human job as the benchmark and think, how can I automate that? I think that's much too narrow a perspective. I don't think you're being creative enough about, because machines have so many capabilities, they can do things in the electromagnetic spectrum, things that humans can't even look at, that you can take advantage of. There's many other things machines can do that humans can't do. But B, the second reason is that if you only focus on replacing and doing what a human can do today, you're going to inevitably devalue human wages and labor. Whereas if you create some new capabilities, there's a good chance you'll make human labor more valuable. Either approach can create wealth, but the way when you complement humans instead of substituting, your wealth is more likely to be widely shared. So if that's one of your values, you should think about that. So why don't you go sometime at lunch or dinner the next couple of days, meet a colleague and brainstorm 3 things that your AI systems could potentially do that no human could do, not to replace a human, not to achieve human-level AI, but to do something entirely different. And then circle the best of those ideas and work on that with your team or your lab. And by the way, don't throw away the other 2 and third ideas. Go ahead and give them to somebody else to work on those. So let me take your questions and comments now. I want to wrap up on that point that we have a lot of ability to steer technical change, that the future is not predetermined, and that if policymakers, if entrepreneurs, if technologists make a conscious effort to create more shared prosperity, I believe it is entirely possible. Over the next 10 years, we are going to have more powerful technologies than we've ever seen on the planet before. We're going to have more wealth than we've ever had before, but we're also going to have tremendous disruption. And as a result, depending on our choices, the next 10 years could be the best 10 years we've ever seen on this planet, or they could be some of the worst 10 years. And that is not something that technology will decide for us. That is something that we will decide. Thank you very much. So I believe there are some microphones. Here we are. There. So if you want to raise your hand, I'd be happy to take a couple of questions. So there's one over there, one over here. So I guess this one's closest, so let's go that one first. How about over on this side? Go ahead. Yeah, you got a mic. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for a very interesting perspective. I was wondering, it was quite US-centric for most of the metric.
Yep.
And US is not necessarily the best example of social net and everything. So how does these plots look like in, say, Sweden, Finland, or other countries? And what can we learn from that to do better things here?
That's a great question. And so there isn't as much widespread data from every country, but there is data, from many of them. And if you look at Sweden, Canada, Germany, Japan, China, in every one of those countries, you have seen growing inequality, growing wage disparities, growing shift from labor to capital, all the trends that I showed you. However, they start at different bases. Sweden started off much more equal, and even though it's become more unequal, it's still more equal than the United States is. So they started at different starting points, but the trends are similar. But some of them have been steeper than others, and Sweden, it has not, actually no, Sweden, let me get that right. Some of them have been steeper than others. I don't want to say off the top which ones were steeper, but they're obviously different slopes, and we can learn from that which ones maybe have policies that have different effects. And since they have different starting points as well, that also suggests that social decisions have a big part of the impact. So the 2 takeaways I have from that is that there's some kind of widespread trend over the past couple of decades that's affecting most advanced countries, but they're having different implementations. A great goal for economists right now is to study which of those policies have a better effect. And I went very quickly through the policy menu, but education is one I put near the top. Earned income tax credit is one. A flexible safety net, for instance, Denmark has something they call flex security, where they have a quite generous safety net, but they also make it very easy for entrepreneurs to hire and fire people and have a dynamic economy that tries new ideas. If somebody gets laid off, they still get their health insurance and their income support and so forth. So that in a way, they get the best of both worlds. The dynamism you need to embrace new technologies and to update your economy, but also the cushions that also I think most of us care about. But that's a value decision. So other side over here.
As we take another question, I ask maybe the next speaker to come up front and start the setup.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was curious about the second point you made about the shift from capital to labor, like people.
Oh no, labor to capital.
Labor to capital. People's labor not being valuable. And on none of those graphs, I think, did it ever go like in the other direction. Do you have any thoughts about what concrete things could be done to reverse the shift towards labor? Being more valuable?
So labor is a very big category, and if you subdivide it, there are certain types of labor, machine learning experts, for instance, that have had, done quite well. CEOs have done well. Lots of kinds of rock stars, in the both figurative and literal sense have done well, if you call those laborers. But the general group of them have done worse. One of the things that most economists would still support, although it's not universal, is reinventing education. And that means less education that's focused on rote, repetitive learning and more on how we can be creative. The good news is as machines automate more of the repetitive tasks, honestly, I think most of us find those kind of boring. There's an increasing need for creative work. There's also an increasing need for interpersonal skills. The hands that I had holding each other. I think a lot of people wouldn't get the same comfort from a robot hand as from a human hand. And so we're wired to care about other people, to be persuaded by them, to listen to them. And so those kinds of professions are things that we can do more to encourage education, to boost interpersonal skills and creative skills. And those are areas where where labor income has been going up relative to the repetitive clerical tasks. I think that, as I said early on in my talk, the big challenge is not that work is disappearing, but that there's a whole bunch of tasks that only humans can do, and we need to shift our skill set into those, and then labor income is likely to go up for those categories. But it may also need things like the earned income tax credit and other ways of supporting. One last point on that is our whole tax system right now is actually very skewed. It heavily puts its thumb on the scale against labor and for capital. If you're an entrepreneur who has $1 million or $1 billion idea, or two ideas, one of which uses a lot of labor and one of which uses no labor, your enterprise will pay a lot more taxes if you use a lot of labor. So in essence, we're penalizing the entrepreneur who uses a lot of labor and giving them more of a free ride if they don't use labor. Is that a smart policy? I don't think so. I think arguably we should be doing the opposite and encouraging people who find ways of getting lots of other humans involved in the game. So there's a set of policies, and I just want to say we don't have all the answers, but you're asking the right question, and I think we have at least some ideas that we could explore them. Do we have time for one more quick question? Great. So,
we'll take the time.
Right up here. Okay.
Hi, Erik. Thank you for a very interesting talk. You didn't mention interest rates during your presentation. How would you go about disambiguating the impact of improved technology and the structural decrease in interest rates we've seen since the early 1980s?
This is one of the biggest mysteries that economists are honestly extremely puzzled about. And when a group of us get together, we all start talking to each other. What do you think is going on with interest rates? Because it's been this long secular trend. I have a paper coming out that ties it to AI because, for me, I think of everything as how it could be related to AI. And it has to do with the way that technology can not only substitute for labor and create more labor, but also capital. If you think about it, software is a kind of capital, and it can replicate. So in a way, many of our investments are now much, much cheaper than they used to be. Software you can scale very rapidly, and if you can, through software, create new goods that used to require physical capital, this, in essence, is adding to our capital stock at a very low way. And one of the effects in our model is that this leads to falling interest rates. And I showed you sort of this division between capital and labor. That's the way almost all economists have been thinking about it. We, in our model, now think of three groups: capital, labor, and this third factor, intangible something. And in our model, vanilla capital and vanilla labor both lose at the expense of this third factor, the factor that can create amazing software and amazing creativity. So if all you have to offer the economy is, ordinary labor skills, you're not in good shape. If all you have is just ordinary capital and say, hey, I want to invest in your startup, you don't get extraordinary returns. But if you have that special sauce that is creating the new value, then you do very, very well. And in our model, both interest rates and wages go down, and the returns go way up to this third factor. So it's a more complicated model, but it's something, to be frank, I don't think there's a consensus around. The stuff I showed you is something that I think there's a pretty broad consensus around in terms of what's happened so far and the new work on what's happening with machine learning. But let me just, I know we're out of time here, so let me just leave you with the really important closing point, which is that technology does not decide what happens to the income distribution. We decide, we technologists, we policymakers, we entrepreneurs, we're the ones who decide how these things work out. It's very much something that is a choice, and I want you to be more conscious of the role you play in those choices, both in your work and as citizens of your countries and of the world. Thank you very much.